My name's John Hawkins, and I've been asked today to do a little tour through the International Towing and Recovery Museum. The International Towing and Recovery Museum has been here 15 plus years. It's basically privately run now. The staff in here has done phenomenal over the last couple years. The whole base of the museum is a lot of the vehicles that you're going to see and we're going to talk a little bit about. It takes us from the 1912s. The first Holmes wrecker was built right here. So what Detroit is to the auto industry, Chattanooga is to the wrecker. We're going to look at some of the earlier Holmeses that you're seeing right here. Here's one of the locomobile that Bobby Myers out of Owensville, Ohio has put back together. This was the concept. They really didn't have pickup trucks or one-ton chassis back there. They would take a car chassis and do modifications and establish what was one of the first twin booms that was done in that era, and this is a 1919 version of it. To my left is what was the stable for the Holmes Company that they would have in their various manufacturing facilities. And now it's was the so-called original Holmes concept that was done on this vehicle. A lot of these concepts were done by actual, Ernest Sr. from having the garage, which was downtown at 212 Market Street, and being challenged with vehicles running into off bridges and into creeks and what have you, and stabilizing the twin boom concept, taking it off to one side to the vehicle to another tree to kind of position that vehicle so it would not move as it was winching up from the other side. So that was really the very earliest versions of what we would call factory built. So as the auto industry grew, not everybody had the ability or the financial wherewithal to go out and purchase a Holmes wrecker, what have you. So a lot of the things, this is a perfect example from Lancer's Garage out of Belgium, Wisconsin, where they took what we call the bubble nose here. It's a GMC 1947 model, and would build this type of homemade wrecker here to go out and do that. Somewhat crude, but it was that point as you're seeing the industry, trucking was starting to become a very viable part. We see it and very union driven because the over-the-road trucks that we know today were nothing like it was when this industry was growing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So this would be somewhat of a homemade type of system, but right over here to my left is a Manley crane, which was very well noted in the industry. It was basically a hand crank situation. The gentlemen, they used chain, sometimes they used cable. But Manley was a production type crane that was put into, as you're starting to see now, into a type of vehicle that was more similar to what we know as a pickup truck or a one-ton vehicle. Rather a gear-driven situation, but it was all manpower. Basically, unlike the Holmes Company, you had where it was operated from the transmission through a PTO and a chain-driven gearbox. This basically was pretty crude. It was hand crank. Back in the early 80s and 90s, we did a lot of work over in China. And you saw a lot of this type of vehicle on Russian or Hungarian military vehicles that they did where up until we really brought the technology of the hydraulic wrecker to China back in that early 90 era. This is another great example that Mr. Rogner does. He's out of the Chicago area. Beautiful restoration on this earlier Ford vehicle here. And this, like the Manley, is the Weaver crane. The Weaver and Manley were the two noted non-Holmes units that were out in the marketplace. Again, taking this cabin chassis type concept, installing this into the body, and you would have that means of manually cranking the recovery of the vehicle. The Roosevelt vehicle that's right here, we're going to talk a little bit, was now one of the earlier 515 versions with the Holmes. We're going to see several of the earlier versions as the Holmes product line was changing. But the neat part about this, it was also one of the first type of cradles that was done with it. You can see that we're kind of really getting into a 2-ton, vehicle, a heavier cabin chassis, dual rear wheels. And this is one of the first versions of what was then a wheel lift. It was a very cumbersome, heavy type of attachment that would fold down and would attach to the front part of the car, and then it would be lifted with these two cables and it would go down. So, you know, we're talking late 40s, early 50s when this concept was out, but it was never successful. The automobiles back in that era were very heavy, chrome bumpers, very difficult to attach to. So this didn't catch on. But by 1983, the first wheel lifts came out. Vulcan, we're going to have a chance to see that. The Century Formula One, that was the huge change within the industry as you started to see all of the current designs today are picking the vehicles up by the very suspension. We have another unique example over here in this Lincoln Continental of the Grazianos with the hairs, going back to that manual winch type system that you have. So this was very common in that era, and this is a beautiful example of how you would be able to take a Lincoln and take that car and turn it into a recovery vehicle in the back. Great restoration up on there. All right, now as we move around, a perfect example, we were talking of the 515 over there. This was actually an earlier version of the split boom that Holmes had with the 460. Really, the 460 was that time when everything started to come in to be a little bit what the concept that they used all the way through the 1980s with the split boom. Here, the split boom was up higher in the mast. It was a higher center of gravity. And as you're going to see as we're working, that boom actually, what we saw over there with the 515, went down to the lower part of the mast because that was a lower center of gravity, and therefore that made the tow truck more viable. This is a beautiful restoration that has been supplied by Reds out of New York with this Ford. Now, right over to my right shoulder is an example of the old Diamond T. Now, this was the beginning of making the large Holmes wrecker. The W35 and the W45 was that era of the late 30s and through the 40s. Today, military business is huge for us at Miller Industries. We have a whole different era, though, of the concept of what's needed for the military side. Now, this unit over here was almost one of a kind. It was a huge updraft from the largest model that Holmes did, which was the Holmes 850. This was only a short production run, very expensive. Example again of the split booms that you see. The operator actually stood up in front of the mast. The winches up in here were 60,000 pound mechanical driven winches. Very, very powerful, but it was way ahead of its time, and therefore it was not a successful model. It's kind of something that we see the beginning of the truck hitch, the T285 truck hitch, which had the extendable arms, and the fact that it was raised and lowered by the cable. So as the vehicles, you started to see how we were attaching to the vehicles was a very critical part. Today, you're unable to use this type of attachment because just like the automobile industries, the trucking industries is all about aerodynamics and fuel miles and everything. So we have to use what we call underlifts today, which was similar to what you were seeing over there earlier with the Roosevelt unit. I've got my hand on the T71, I believe it could have been a 72 model cradle snatcher. So basically, Holmes, Century, and Vulcan almost within this era of 1973, 74, 75, were coming to the plate with the hydraulic wrecker. But this was the first wheel lift that we saw. The cradle snatcher basically did that. This portion would extend in and out. The boom would also raise up and down, and you had these two cradles. There would be one that would go on the front of the vehicle and one on the back side of the vehicle. You would tie them together with a chain, and then they would lift up. And you were lifting the vehicle by the tires. So that was it. It was nearly 8 or 9 years ahead of its time. Large wreckers were to follow. The Century 1030 was on a Chevrolet Bison tandem axle. was the first 30-ton, 3-stage recovery boom. Really was a huge industry changer up on that. And in that time in the 80s, you start to seeing what we were looking at earlier on, the mechanical wrecker just slowly go away as hydraulics, started to take the market. And as you see right here, this was the first entry-level large wrecker for the Jerr-Dan company. It basically was in the mid-90s that this came out. It was very unique in design because it had a composite body. But as you also can see, here is the underlift. And so as we talked about cradle snatchers, you now went away from the truck hitch, which we saw in the 285 over there on Dad's truck, and we now have an underlift. And that's basically what it does. It's an underlift. It folds down, it goes underneath the front of the vehicle or the back of the vehicle, and we have what we call frame forks that attach to the axle, the frame, the springs or whatever. There's multiple types of attachments that are done on that side, and we actually lift up the vehicle today by the very suspension it goes on the road. So today, through the whole industry, whether it's automotive and the small wrecker, the car carriers, the large wreckers, everything is basically picking it up by the very suspension that it goes down on the road. Now, one of the things we're going to look at right here, where we have one of the first what we call hydraulic hookups. This was the dynamic that was done by the Craze family out of Virginia. It was basically something that came up in the earlier 90s. So as we were looking at the wheel lift era coming in, basically you had to get out of the vehicle and put some type of attachment on the grid of the wheel lift in order to pick the tires up. This was the first time that we saw a hydraulic mechanism that allowed the customer to basically, or the driver, to stay in the truck. He can actually back up to the vehicle. This would lower down to the ground. This claw would open up down to here, and then he would back up underneath the vehicle. He'd hit a switch on his handheld control, and this would just close up in behind the tire. He'd lift the boom and going down the road. This is huge today in what we call the repo business. So today you have the 810, the 812, the 408s, and all kinds of different versions that have come off this one dynamic model right here. Again, mid-90s when this came on up. Let's go back a little bit in time. We can talk about, again, one of the unique designs that were done with this vehicle right here. This is a Brockway. This is something where a lot of concept was put in. It was actually, this would slide back and forth. So it was one of the first versions of what you want to call an extendable boom. I get a chuckle out of here. Here's the jacks that were used. These bad boys probably weigh 150 pounds apiece. And the way that we used to have these go on the side of the roads, they were the lanterns that would tell you that there was an incident happening. They were kerosene filled, and that was your old concept of how we had flares and everything that came onto that. But a lot of time and energy went into the thought of what was done here with the history of Mr. Bartnick when he was putting this whole together. Also, the first beginning of what we were seeing, what we call the snatch block. The snatch blocks are here for two reasons, basically a change of direction with the cable during a pull or an enhanced power. If you go out to the casualty, put the snatch block in place and bring the cable back to the tow vehicle or to another vehicle or to another tree, creating a dead man. If you had a 30,000 pound winch, because it went out and came back, you now had 60,000 pounds of pulling power. Today, snatch blocks are a critical thing we do in every form of recovery that we do, and snatch blocks today can cost as much as $600 to $700, $800, $1,000 in a 15-ton capacity. After Miller acquired Challenger, Mr. Bottoms went up and started another business, B&B, and this is an example of one of his hydraulic trucks. The Ramsey winch. The Ramsey winch started coming in with the early Holmes 475. We mentioned a little bit about this, and taking a mechanical wrecker that we just saw and coming into a hydraulic version of it. This is a Ramsey 246, was an extremely popular, still in the marketplace today. Probably one of the most bulletproof winches that you have, and should belong on every carrier that's done. This was also an era in the 2000s where you started seeing the larger GVW chassis for a 10, 12, 14 ton unit. Now, this very colorful here, but this shows a lot of what the industry does. When women's breast cancer was looking at getting a lot of attention. You saw a lot of tow companies take one of their vehicles and support that that whole drive to, the awareness of the illness and making sure that, you do go and get tested and what have you. So this is it. You see this a lot in the towing and recovery industry during parades where they'll participate. There are city, county, and state contracts that tow truck guys are doing, but I have to say that I've seen the industry get behind a lot of things, including the big one right now is the Move Over Law. We are here at the museum, and just this morning we put 41 people on the wall that lost their life over the last year and a half, all and 33 of them while they were doing their job when they were struck on the side of the road. And it's just sad to see that. I tell people in a lot of other industries that the towing and recovery industry, if you're in that situation where you do need a lift, you do need a tow, whether it's a carrier or a wrecker, is that these guys, we lose more drivers annually per capita than law enforcement and fire combined. So it's very dangerous. So make sure that you stay off the shoulders and away and get your vehicle off as far as what you can in order to protect yourself. And also when the service provider comes, it helps him also. So we're going to finish everything up in here as far as the museum and talk a little bit about this, because this was a changing in the industry, basically the late 60s and into the 70s. Ford and Chevrolet were the predominant cabs and chassis in what we call the 1-ton, a 10,000 GVW truck. So you started seeing a cab and chassis specifically done for, what the towers were going to purchase with. In this day, this truck was right in between $3,000 to $4,000, depending on the model and the features that were coming. You were starting to get air conditioning, sometimes automatic transmissions. But this was the workhorse of the towing and recovery industry. And this also, what I'm leaning on, was the most popular and probably the #1 manufactured piece of equipment. This is the Holmes 440. It was a vision of every service station in every corner at that point. With it really predominantly all of the towers were somehow involved in having a service station. The Holmes 440, as I mentioned earlier, was about a $3,000 or $4,000 purchase. A piece of equipment comes in a box, a crate, I should say. Would be installed by the distributor and then onto this 1-ton cab and chassis. So your package was somewhere in between the $6,000 and $8,000. In this time era, Holmes was the dominant manufacturer. Tremendous upfront area with all the souvenirs and trinkets and clothing and apparel that the museum has to offer. Being here in the founding city of the towing and recovery industry and down here at the foot of Lookout Mountain, I don't think we could ask for a better location to have the International Towing and Recovery. And we welcome you to come at any time. This belongs to the towing industry. And if you have the opportunity to ever come in October to the festival to see the Hall of Fame and the Wall of Fallen, we would like to have you here as a guest to the museum in Chattanooga soon. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was a quick little tour through the little bit of the history of the towing and recovery. And come and see us.